Good morning, Jeff. It's Monday morning at the Toronto Film Festival, and we were out late last night.
Yes, we were out too late last night. Well, I don't know about you. I was out too late last night.
So, you've been on the loving trail for a while now, and when you show it to audiences in Cannes and in Toronto, what's the difference?
You know, it's not just about the differences in the audiences, which those completely exist. The thing that has struck me with this particular film and this particular time is where we're at, especially in this country, well, in America. We're in a different place this month than we were in May.
Explain that.
Well, if you look at, the police shootings in Dallas, in Baton Rouge, the tenor of the conversation has evolved just even in these series of months, and that's kind of what I'm fascinated by. The film hasn't changed, the lovings haven't changed, but the conversation keeps evolving.
Well, what we're dealing with here is a movie that goes back in time. It tells us a story that I remember reading about in Life magazine.
Wonderful.
I'm that old, okay? But
the problem is it's not that old.
It was a memorable story.
Yes.
And it's a story of a true couple, and what that story did and what a later documentary did was to show what their real lives were like.
Right.
And it strikes me that the challenge you faced in telling the story was reaching that natural reality, bringing it to an audience in a compelling way without getting Hollywood about it.
I was less concerned with the Hollywood side of things, and it's more about keeping it compelling. That's the tightrope that you walk. When you start to look at that archival footage in the documentary and you start to learn more about the lovings, it's very simple that you're not going to go for a bombastic film. That just wouldn't represent them appropriately. It would just seem like an absurd conclusion to draw from any study that you would make into their lives. The tricky part is just finding enough details that you can prove that existed in order to make the film work as a movie. The back half of this film, it's a really strange structure. I've said before I don't really work in 3-act structure, and I certainly didn't in this case. There's no traditional climax in this film. It really is just based on this emotional journey that these two people go through for nearly a decade. In any traditional narrative, you would have a much different structure, but that's never really scared me. In fact, it's always interested me as a storyteller, is to find ways to think about narrative that that service the people at the center of the story and the behavior of those people rather than a plot construct. But I feel like this film, had you gotten to the end of it and it not represented in an honest way the personalities of these people, I feel like that would have been a bigger failure.
Right. What really moved me is that you feel deeply, I think, the love that these two people had for each other. And Joel Edgerton isn't playing an articulate person.
Not at all.
And that's another thing you had to deal with.
Well, and also you have to think about the level of intelligence. It's something Joel and I spoke about a lot. There are some concepts that Richard Loving, just probably didn't fully have his, head wrapped around, and it was like,
he's a construction worker.
Yeah, he's a brick mason, and Mildred is certainly the active participant between the two of them in terms of pushing the court case forward, and really making sure that this thing advanced to the level that it got to. But for Joel and I, it was like, well, we can't have you completely blunted, because that's you're at least 50% of our point of view of this film, and we don't want people not being able to identify. So a lot of times what we saw was a frustration in his inability to articulate his frustration and his emotions. And I think there are a lot of people like that, especially kind of blue-collar, working-class Southern men. I feel like I've written characters like that before in my films. But
how do you get it across as a filmmaker? You need an actor who can show
you need a
without
great actor.
speaking.
Certainly, you need a great actor, and I think that actor and my script have to be in unison. It's not just hey, sit there and look interesting. Just because there's no dialogue doesn't mean nothing's happening, and so you have to understand the purpose of every scene and the purpose of every moment in every scene.
Well, finally, I think what it comes down to is that this man, and then there is one scene where he finally sort of articulates this. He cannot understand or abide the idea that the government in any way would interfere with his ability to take care of his wife and his family.
Why would anyone bother you with that? Because I'm not bothering anyone else. And it's, he's constantly emasculated in that. And obviously you start to get into the cult of domesticity from the period and everything else, but that's what's so beautiful. Anybody that really knows something about marriage knows that one person does not carry the weight. It is, you depend on one another, and that's what I found so beautiful about the statement that I found that Mildred said before she passed away. He took care of me, because that she took care of him just as much, and they needed one another. And I mean, I get emotional just thinking about it, and isn't that what we look for in our stories? I don't need a speech from Richard about marriage equality or race, or I needed that speech, which was, 3 lines.
Was that a big deal, finding that nugget?
That was huge. Recognizing
that was the center of your movie?
That was huge. Because again, I was really wrestling with this back half, what are we doing in the back half of this film? And so when I found that, I'd obviously been thinking about how emasculated Richard must be feeling, and when I read that line, it's like validation, and I thought, yeah, it just made sense to me that he would have constantly been confronted with this idea of just divorce her. You come from a place of white privilege. You could easily walk back over into it. Why wouldn't you? And he refuses to do it. But in refusing to do it, it takes away the one thing that he wants to do, which is take care of his family. And that scene just flooded in.
The other scene that I loved was the mother.
Oh.
She was great.
Oh, she's amazing.
She was like who was that person?
She's a wonderful actress out of Georgia. And if you look at photographs of Richard's real mother, they are very similar looking.
So she's a midwife.
Yes.
And she loves her son.
Absolutely.
But man, is she tough on this.
Well, what I find interesting is she echoes the exact words of the sheriff. You knew better. Which is really, I think, too, it's kind of what the audience might be thinking. Like didn't you all know better? Didn't you all know that this would be a problem? I'll say, I just want to go back to the other big revelation that I had, though, was the opening. That took a little while to come to as well, because it's tricky when you're telling personal stories. They met when they were really young. They grew up in the same community together, and I was like, wow, how do we, do I show other actors as young kids and then seeing each other in a field, and it just seemed horrible, like a horrible approach. And then I thought, well, after looking into the dates of birth and the dates of arrest, I was like, oh my gosh, she was pregnant. And she had to tell him. At some point, she had to tell him. And I thought, Richard strikes me as the kind of guy that would be happy about that. And because I've had that moment. My wife told me she was pregnant, and it's a tremendous mix of emotions. And then I was like, well, that's the kind of moment that can explain exactly where they're at, exactly where they've been, and really where they're going, all kind of in one moment. And this scene later, if I Can Take Care of You, does the same thing. You don't always find them as a writer, but when you stumble upon them, they're very important because they're representative without feeling, heavy-handed or weighted. But those were the two linchpins for me, I think.
And casting the movie correctly.
Always.
So that's interesting. You went with a Brit and
Yeah.
an Aussie.
Yeah. Well, really, she's Irish. Yeah. To be honest, the decision to cast Joel was more calculated than the decision to cast Ruth. Our casting director, Francine Maisler, we had auditions, and Ruth was the first person she brought in. I wasn't familiar with her or her work. I did not know she was Irish. She was really nervous when she came in, and I get nervous in those situations too, so I just said, okay, well, just go for it. And so we really didn't talk, and she straightens her posture, and she becomes Mildred over the course of these scenes in the audition. And then afterward, I start talking to her a little bit, and this Irish accent comes out, and it was so confusing. But at that point, it didn't matter, because she was already Mildred. She had done exactly what I'd been doing, which is poring over this archival footage. She had listened to it. She had the voice, the posture, the way she held her mouth. Now with Joel, I was working on Midnight Special and with him, and I was just watching the way he works. And I saw how he handled a Texas accent for that film. And we watched the Errol Morris documentary and pulled, there's a man in that who's a detective from Vidor, Texas. We pulled a clip of audio from that. And he just, I saw him, he just rehearsed it. And he sent it to me once. And I thought he was sending me the clip from the documentary, but it was him. And I couldn't tell the difference. And I knew that we had enough, archival footage and audio of the real Richard, that to give that to a person with that, skill, he would really be able to inhabit
And he
that
also
character.
had the physicality.
The shoulders
the way
and
he holds himself and that the sort of the big. You shot it on purpose, obviously, but those sort of big hands.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, I mean, he looks like a bricklayer. And so it wasn't, American, non-American. I'll say this though, having watched Joel's process in Midnight Special of approaching an accent and a voice, I had Richard's voice in my head so much. It wasn't enough just to cast an actor from the South, which I've done plenty of, that might have a beautiful Southern accent, which I really appreciate. But it might not be Richard's accent. That Virginia dialect is really strange. It's like got a coastal influence. They say about instead of about. Not to mention it's affected by the period as well, and by Richard. Richard himself has a very clipped speech, and the teeth affect the way he speaks. And I just knew Joel could do the work, the work to bring it to life. Because ultimately, what I was searching for were people to represent the real people that I had in my head when I wrote the script.
All right. Well, it turns out that the movie is even more timely than we could have anticipated. You had a sense that it was addressing something that we needed to talk about. It felt strong to you.
Sure. Well, I started writing this thing back in 2012, and the most out front, social connection was marriage equality. But then all of these issues of race have presented themselves in the last 4 years in such an aggressive way. It makes it the most immediate connection right now. But that's kind of the point I was making between May and September. Even that conversation is constantly evolving, and I just feel like people need to be aggressive about these conversations. They need to be heated. As Americans, we have to confront this stuff. But in doing so, we cannot forget the humanity at the center of these things. It is very, very easy just to talk about ideological views and platform thinking, especially in a political year like this. And it's very, very easy to forget about people. And that's all the Lovings are. That's all they did. And it was enough to change our country.
Thank you.